Howard Kurtz is the Media Buzz host for the Fox News Channel and the author of the latest book, Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, and the War Over the Truth. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Could you connect the dots between those things, the president, the press, and this matter of truth? What are you trying to say?
I'm trying to say there's a scorched earth warfare going on between the two sides. Now, in every administration, you said you read my book, Spin Cycle, about the Clinton White House, there is a natural adversarial tension between the two. But we have never seen anything like this. We have never seen such unrelentingly negative coverage, often very personal, harshly personal, I would say, in nature, as we are seeing against this president. And we have never seen a president of the United States constantly on the attack against the news business, fake news, dishonest media, and I think it's damaging both sides. But my great concern in writing this as a lifelong journalist is that it's damaging the press more.
Well, how has the press changed, or at least coverage of the presidency changed because of the president so far?
Well, I mean, we saw this beginning in the campaign when, first of all, the press, the pundits as a whole, didn't take Donald Trump all that seriously. He was a sideshow. It was very entertaining, but of course he wasn't going to make it to Iowa. He would never win the nomination, and everybody knew that he was not going to beat Hillary Clinton. I know your previous guest was talking about her. Beyond that, there were all these gloom and doom prophecies about, this controversy will finish him off. Well, he'll never survive this one. We see that again now. There is a sense in the mainstream press that many say that we can't normalize Donald Trump's presidency. What does that tell you? First of all, it tells you they view him as unfit for office. Many, not all, many reporters are fair. And that they view him as, you've heard all the words, unhinged, mentally unbalanced, incompetent, but also a dictator. It's interesting, the range of descriptions of this president. At the same time, this is a book that goes behind the scenes at the Trump White House. I talk about how the president suffers in his aides description from defiance disorder. They tell him not to do something. He does it anyway because nobody tells Donald Trump what to do. And there are times when it is very effective for him to lash out at the press, which he thinks and which his supporters believe is treating him very unfairly. And there are times when he goes too far or distracts from his own agenda.
You tell a story in the book about meeting Donald Trump, and he said things to you about how he views press, particularly negative coverage. What did he say?
Well, I interviewed the now president a half dozen times during the campaign. In fact, I first met him in the late 1980s in New York, and that's one of the reasons I did underestimate him in the campaign. I saw his media mastery as a New York guy. What he said to me was that he couldn't get over the fact that some commentators, in his view, have hatred for him. He used that word, hatred, and he is a counterpuncher, and so if somebody hates him, he hates back on them. But at the same time, he was kind of wounded by that, and there is a love-hate relationship in a way, mostly hate right now, with this president, because he really wants the approval of the media. He always got good media coverage by and large when he was a businessman, reality TV show guy, and so forth. A year ago, he had a private off-the-record meeting with network anchors in which they asked him his biggest surprise as president. He says, it's that you guys never changed your coverage once I became president. And this, of course, dovetails with all the major events of his presidency, the Charlottesville tragedy, the Russia investigation, which is back in the news. He is just convinced he's not getting a fair shake, but he also meets privately with people like NBC's Chuck Todd, I explained in the book, and others, because there's a way in which he works the refs. He's trying to win them over. He's done it with me.
But even right in the book, apart this, he said Donald Trump is staking his presidency as he did his election on nothing less than destroying the credibility of the news media, and the media are determined to do the same to him. You go on, but expand on that in light of what you just said.
Yeah, well, there is now, it turns out to be good box office for major news organizations. You turn them on at night. There are these panels 6-1 against Trump, who are sort of largely appealing to an anti-Trump audience. It may be good business, but the problem is there is a whole chunk of the country, 63 million Americans, who voted for Donald Trump. Many still enthusiastically support this president. And to them, not only do they think that their guy, their champion, is being treated unfairly, but they believe, with some justification, as I write in Media Madness, that the elite media, particularly here in Washington, New York, LA, look down on them, view them condescendingly. There's one headline I'll never forget in the left-leaning Huffington Post. A vote for Trump was a hate crime. Well, that kind of condescending attitude does undercut the credibility of the media among those who are not within this particular bubble.
Howard Kurtz, our guest. He is the Media Buzz host on the Fox News Channel and also the author of the book Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, and the war over the troop. If you want to ask him questions about the coverage of Donald Trump, President Trump, by the media, you can call 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, Independents, 202-748-8002. And you can also tweet us your thoughts at C-SPAN WJ. Does President Trump enjoy a relationship with certain then type of conservative media who speak favorably about him? Would you say Fox News is part of that?
I have some thoughts on that. First of all, in the campaign, the president told me he thought Fox News was treating him unfairly. Obviously, he's revised that view. But there are a number of prominent conservative commentators, some of whom work at Fox, people at National Review, Weekly Standard, who were never Trump in the campaign, who are still pretty critical of this president. So even though he's a conservative Republican president, he doesn't enjoy a cheering squad on the right. Obviously, there are some. And obviously, primetime hosts on Fox News and Fox and Friends are much more sympathetic to this president, let's say, than the other cable news channels. At the same time, the president... sometimes, when he is pushing back against the media, and I write examples of this, I think he shouldn't be punching down at individual cable news hosts. I think that's beneath him. Sometimes he does it as a strategy to take the spotlight off of something else. Other times it's just, it is actually good politics for him. It plays very well with his most loyal supporters to beat up on a news business that they don't trust anyway. And the lack of trust, the diminishing trust, this is been happening for decades, long before Donald Trump was in politics, I think is what is eroding a business that I love, that I grew up in, that I want to be perceived as fair. And I think right now it's the cool thing to do is to be against Donald Trump. In fact, to question, is he going to survive? Is he mentally able to handle this office? And that seems to a lot of people to be unfair. When
it comes to coverage of the White House, as part of your concerns is what happens for the next presidents after Donald Trump's influence on this media.
Right. And beyond that, there will be a time when Donald Trump is no longer president, whether it's in 3 years or 7 years. And I think some of the wounds, some of them self-inflicted, that the media are inflicting on themselves, where they're seen as one-sided, where people don't trust the fact checkers anymore, which is a problem because we are not agreeing on a basic set of facts. Everybody's in their own ideological bubbles. I think the damage being done now, and it's just not to say that some of the reporting on the president hasn't been good, that some of the investigative reporting on him hasn't been spot on, but collectively, the damage being done now, I believe, is going to last far beyond Donald Trump's presidency.
First call for you comes from Joe, and Joe is in Valley Cottage, New York. Our line for Republicans, you're on with Howard Kurtz. Go ahead.
Good morning, guys. Howie, just want to say I watch your show every Sunday. You're the epitome of fair and balanced.
Thank you.
You have a terrific show, and I wish that they would give you a weekly show, which would be great. But anyway, Howie, the reason I called was Fox has been stressing lately about this Uranium One incident about selling American uranium. The president has mentioned it. Senator John Barrasso wrote an article in the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal date from Thursday, February 8, 2018, which discusses this whole thing. It would be great if you could have the senator on your show. I don't know if you're familiar with the article. Possibly Pedro could bring it up. But it clears up a lot of stuff about why we have a shortage of uranium and what's actually going on. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you. I don't think there's any question, as somebody who covered this campaign intensively, that there was a lot of influence peddling and attempted influence peddling surrounding the Clinton Foundation, surrounding the former president's speeches. At the same time, and I'm not saying none of this should be looked at, but Hillary Clinton lost the election. She is not president. She's not going to be president. And I think that some people who excessively focus on her are in part trying to deflect attention from the investigations of President Trump. Now, I will jump in here and add that we've had about a year of investigations now. We just had last week the Bob Mueller indictments against 13 Russians, which didn't find any active collusion on the part of anybody associated with Donald Trump. So we don't know where this will end up, but that focus of the investigation seems not to have unearthed a whole lot. At the same time, the president's dismissing it as fake news and a hoax. Well, it's not a hoax. It's a real investigation. There have been guilty pleas and indictments lately, most recently against these 13 Russians. So I think it's really important for the press to be fair in covering this investigation. It is news. It is a serious investigation. That much is clear. At the same time, we shouldn't be seen as sometimes on nighttime cable hyping every incremental development into the next Watergate. If everything's an 11, then nothing's an 11.
Independent line from North Carolina. Sandra, hello.
Yes, I just want to say, Howard, you do a great job.
Thank you.
And the reason I watch Fox News is because they tell the truth, and I'll turn over to another station just to see what they're saying, and it's like a lie. It's like they don't put everything into it and everything, and I just believe in Fox News because they tell the truth. They're getting, like Hannity. I love Hannity. He is so awesome. Tucker, awesome. And I just want to say, keep it up. You do a great job. And I know your heart is in the media. Just keep it up, because we look for you. We look to the truth to you because we know you tell the truth. The rest of the media does not tell the truth. I'm sorry to say. They do not. They've just completely lost it, just like the Democrats. Thank you.
Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you for the kind words. I mean, I've written a whole book about what I think is often unfair coverage of the president, but I wouldn't go so far as to say none of the other media tell the truth. I do think many journalists have an agenda, and part of what I write about in Media Madness is what they say privately about President Trump, what they say on Twitter when they think only their pals are listening.
Such as what?
Such as a New York Times reporter who said privately during the campaign to an RNC staff member that Donald Trump was a racist and a fascist, and that those in the Republican Party supporting him were also complicit in that racism and fascism. Such as a Wall Street Journal reporter who said on Twitter after the president pulled out of the Paris climate deal that he was threatening the planet just to appease his base after 4 months in office. Sean Spicer called and complained, and he deleted that tweet. So it's that kind of thing. And by the way, since Fox came up, we have a news division, people like me, Chris Wallace, Brett Baer, Ed Henry, who try to be journalists and cover the president fairly, and that means it's not always favorable. And then we have opinion people, and she seems to be a big fan of Hannity and Tucker, and obviously they are paid for their opinions.
Well, what strikes you when she says she sees the truth, but she points to the opinionists, is that a concern for you?
I think most viewers, readers, people who consume news online are pretty sophisticated about this stuff. Look, there's a natural tendency to like people who agree with your worldview. And so the people who love Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, probably most of them are very liberal. She's a smart Rhodes Scholar. If she goes too far, I say so. But, I understand that it's an almost tribal loyalty these days in this hyper-partisan media atmosphere. I just find the need to remind people, and this is true at CNN and MSNBC, and it's true on the New York Times, which has an editorial page and an op-ed page that are separate from the news pages, that there are people who at least are in the business of trying to coin a phrase, fair and balanced, and others who are conservative, liberal, libertarian, who are in the business of giving opinions.
Democrats line from Atlanta, Georgia. Michelle, you're on with Howard Kurtz.
Yes, Pedro, I don't believe nothing that this man is spouting out. Donald Trump is a bigot. He's a racist. He's a narcissist. And he's a Klansman. I don't believe anything coming out of the mouth of the Republican Party.
Michelle, since we have our guest right here, why don't you address her question or comment directly to him? Michelle, are you there?
All he wants to. But for 8 years, we as Democrats had to sit here and listen to the Republican Party dog our President Obama. But let me tell you something. It's going to be a new day in 2018 because every black, every brown, every Democrat are going out there, and we're going to show this fool that's sitting up here trying to glorify Trump.
Okay, we'll leave it there because we invite him as our guest. We don't want to insult him. But you've seen a lot of media coverage of administrations. Did President Obama get a pass from the media?
Well, in the 2008 campaign, I've never seen a presidential candidate in my lifetime get softer treatment than Barack Obama did. I think even many of his fans would not dispute that. I think he had a pretty easy first term. I think he had rougher coverage in the second term when with the Republican Congress, had a lot of trouble getting things through and was sort of checkmated in areas like Syria. Look, the caller, there's a lot of people who feel that way. Donald Trump is a polarizing president. There are people who absolutely love the guy. They think he tells it like it is. He's a straight shooter. They like the way he talks. He doesn't weigh his words carefully like most focus group politicians. There are people who think he never should have been president, and they're offended by the fact that he is in office. So a lot of views of the media are obviously viewed through that prism. If you think Donald Trump is a good or great president, then you're not going to like a lot of the coverage in several major news organizations. If you think that Donald Trump is a terrible president, you're probably not going to be a big fan of Fox News coverage, and you're probably going to like his liberal attackers. I try in this book to go beyond that, to stick to the facts. Again, there's a lot of reporting in this book, not just about the media and how the president deals with the media, but also about his dealings with his staff, who are engaged in a lot of self-destructive leaks. We're seeing that right now against John Kelly. Previously, it was against Reince Priebus, Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, and Steve Bannon got into the varying finger-pointing battles about who was leaking about whom. So as a journalist, I try to stick to the facts. I know everybody out there has opinions. That's healthy.
This is our guest, Howard Kurtz, the book Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, and the War Over the Truth, joining us. Chester, Virginia, Republican line. Mark, go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. Harry, I love your show.
Thank you.
I have a question. We never find any up-to-date info on the actual ratings. It's like the day of the election, CNN to flip the switch on the coverage, and it's been just bad ever since. But I'd like to know how many folks have actually left watching CNN and moved over to Fox, and the difference in the ratings, and if you think those ratings are going to make a difference. And, when the woman commented about it, she loved the opinionists. I like the opinionists too, but I also like the facts. But when the opinionists show statute numbers that were violated, stuff that's obviously illegal, then, they may not like what they're hearing, but at least you're telling you exactly what was done wrong and who did it wrong. How can anybody ignore those facts with the other stations? I know they don't show a lot of them, but eventually this information is going to get to them. And how do they ignore when they can show you statute violations that were done?
Well, there's an irony here in the Trump presidency when you bring up this question of ratings. CNN's ratings are higher than they have been in many, many years. MSNBC, which was really struggling a few short years ago, is having ratings probably the highest in the history of that channel. Now, Fox News ratings are also up, and Fox News remains number one in cable news, as it has been for almost 2 decades. But the fact is that taking, particularly in primetime, but even overall, taking a more skeptical, aggressive, sometimes negative, sometimes unfair approach to President Trump has helped the other 2 cable news channels. The New York Times, which the president calls the failing New York Times. In fact, he's once called the newspaper evil. But he still continues to talk to the Times. It's his hometown paper, which goes to the sort of love-hate relationship I mentioned earlier. Digital subscriptions are soaring. Washington Post, digital subscriptions are way up. So even as both sides are locked in this increasingly ugly battle, Trump has been a goldmine for these news organizations, and they present a very big fat target for him, at least with that portion of the country, a growing portion of the country that doesn't trust the media.
Did Donald Trump have the same attitude? You talked about his attitude towards the media. How did that change once television entered into it, particularly his television career and how he treated the media and used the media?
Donald Trump always had a sort of intuitive feel for how to make news in that New York market, which I watched firsthand when I lived in New York and covered him, even covered his divorce from Ivana, which you had the New York Daily News and the New York Post on opposite sides, one backed Donald, one backed Ivana. I remember calling him during that time, and I was the out-of-town reporter for the Washington Post, but he's not going to call me back on this. Calls me right back, gives me a few sound bites. Donald Trump knows that controversy sells, and that even when he's getting beat up, he knows, and he learned this in New York, and it is true today as president. Negative coverage helps this president. Now, that sounds counterintuitive, like, who wants to get beat up? But when the president is getting beat up on, his handling of just about anything, immigration, for example, it means that he dominates the news cycle. It means that every story is like attacking Trump, some defend Trump, attacking Trump. If Trump then hits back at the fake media, which a term that I don't use, and I think that he uses too often. But when he hits back at news organizations and coverage, then that extends the news cycle, because we love to talk about ourselves. So all that uses up most of the oxygen. This was true in the campaign, too. Everyone said, he gets all this free airtime. Well, he gave hundreds of interviews. Most of the other candidates didn't. And even when the interviewers were beating up on him, again, he's dominating that news agenda. And that's an important thing, even when you're president, even when you've got the big bully pulpit. To be, some say, well, maybe we need a break from Donald Trump. We should just go on vacation and not tweet for a week. That apparently is not happening.
He just tweeted out, actually, this about the Russia investigation. He's saying that I've been much tougher on Russia than Obama. Let's look at the facts. Total fake news. Talk about Twitter. How has it totally changed the reporting on this president?
Well, for one thing, it means we all work 24/7. I mean, you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, he's already tweeted. I go out to get a sandwich. I come back 30 minutes later, the world has changed because he's put out more tweets. It's a very effective means for him to go through around the media filter and communicate directly with his people. Now, do I think, and do many of his closest advisors, as I write in this book, believe that sometimes he goes too far? That he shouldn't be giving disparaging nicknames to political opponents and journalists. He did this with Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski on MSNBC. There's a whole backstory in the book about their relationship, once friendly, now very hostile. And sometimes he does it to distract, as I mentioned earlier. But it's not something that is going to end. All the Kellyanne Conway and the rest, they've all know that they can't take away his phone, that this is part of who he is. He believes it helped him get elected. Whether he's toned it down at times, and I think that has helped him. But then inevitably something ticks him off. He watches something on cable news. In fact, this whole tweet storm over the weekend in response to Mueller's indictment of the 13 Russians very much had to do with the president initially claimed vindication, but as he saw a lot of criticism because he says, I've done more against Russia. But what he hasn't done is says this was a terrible attack on our country and there's going to be retaliation. He's got a lot of criticism for that, which in turn
about the formal press conferences this president has had. How do they compare with the previous administrations, but also how much access does Donald Trump give the
Well, if you just measure it by formal press conferences, it's very little. He's done basically one, and that is obviously far fewer than the other president. But journalists will tell you privately Donald provides with more many of presidents, because just about every day he's stopping to take questions. He'll answer a couple of questions at a photo op. He'll stand by the helicopter and take questions. Photographers say they have more access to this president. And then there's the off-the-record part. I mentioned NBC's Chuck Todd. He's had several off-the-record meetings with the president, even though the president publicly criticizes him. And what happens, as I describe in this book, is that the president starts out yelling at Chuck over something he said or something NBC's reported. Chuck yells back, and then they settle down to a civil conversation. And at the end of one of these meetings, Chuck Todd turned to Hope Hicks, the communications director, and said, "We just can't quit each other."
From Rochester, New York, Independent Line, Carol, hello.
Good morning. I think that I used to watch Fox and MSNBC like for more hard news. I skip the opinion people, but I think both sides tell the truth. They just emphasize different stories that maybe suit their worldview or philosophy, because I would switch from one channel to another and you wouldn't hear anything about what the other people were saying. And I will say that I stopped watching the cable news, and my life is so much better. I don't miss it at all. I do watch C-SPAN, but I tell you, it just makes everybody crazy. I mean, if a spider walked across President Trump's desk, they'd be on that for half an hour.
Thank you, Carol. Appreciate it.
Well, there are people who I think are turned off by the contentious and sometimes polarized nature of cable news, and this applies to all the channels, and especially because, the politics in the Trump era seems so polarized. I can see where it's just an overload. There are even days on Saturday when I may not turn on the TV just to get a break. And I understand people just kind of wanting to maybe watch C-SPAN instead. On your earlier point, I do notice, and I sometimes comment about this in my columns on foxnews.com or on my Media Buzz program, that if a story is favorable to President Trump, it may get more play on certain channels and very little on others, and then you flip it. A negative story maybe go wall to wall, particularly in prime time. I've noticed a pattern here. In the book, I call them evening earthquakes. The New York Times, the Washington Post will pop an investigative story, usually around 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. It's going to be in the next day's paper. They put it online. And then CNN and MSNBC pretty much can go wall to wall on it, often having reporters from those papers who are contributors on to talk about it. Fox may deal with it somewhat differently. And these, my advice to people is always like, be an informed consumer. Don't just stay in a bubble. If you're of one political stripe or another, see what the other side is saying. That's how you form the best opinions rather than just being in an echo chamber.
How much of these reports that you see are based on unnamed sources, and does that trend increased with this coverage of the administration, or has that always been consistent?
Way too many, and it's increased. And I, as an old investigative reporter, I always say that there are some stories that cannot be reported without unnamed sources because people could lose their jobs or be at risk if they're exposing wrongdoing. But where it's getting perverted and just way overused is in political stories where it's just people taking pot shots anonymously. The papers are supposed to have rules about that, but they're often violated. Here's a classic example. So John Kelly, understandably, the chief of staff, is under a lot of heat for the Rob Porter mess. He's the fired presidential aide who had the allegations of abuse from 2 ex-wives. A lot of leaks from other White House officials and other Trump advisors against Kelly, who I guess is struggling to sort of keep his hold. The general is struggling to keep his hold on the staff. But the Washington Post quoted one White House official anonymously from without having to put the person's name on the line, saying that Kelly was a big fat liar. Well, I don't think that's the kind of thing that should be said anonymously. If you want to make the case as to where you think he deviated in telling his story, and Kelly did make mistakes in handling this, there is no question, then do that. But when you have one side saying big fat liar, or he's running a cover-up, I don't think that we as journalists in a political story, that's not should be granting anonymity for those kind of potshots.
From New York, Rego Park, New York, Democrats line. Michael, go ahead.
Hi. I just have a question for the guest, and that is, for years now, since the 70s, the FBI has always gone after protesters, peace, anti-war, environmentalists. I remember reading a story once where they went after and spied on the Boy Scouts and old women's groups because they were anti-war. And then they had them labeled terrorists. If you're demonstrating down at Wall Street or a tree hugger march, they would call it a terrorist organization. But I want to ask you, why isn't anybody calling the Russians terrorists?
Okay, caller, thanks.
Well, I think they're cyber terrorists is the term that I would use. There's no question that this was a coordinated effort, apparently with the indirect blessing of the Russian government, to attack American democracy, not with bombs or bullets, but with a campaign of disruption that, by the way, wasn't just, a lot of posts on Facebook and some fake Twitter identities. The indictment returned last week shows that some of these Russians impersonated Americans, engaged in identity theft using phony social security numbers. So this was a pretty broad attack. I mean, your point about the FBI in past decades, certainly, and this has been investigated and exposed, the FBI was used and misused for political purposes. I know people think the FBI's role in the Russian investigation right now is controversial, but I think the worst excesses of the past have been corrected after a lot of public exposure. As far as your other point, I think I've addressed that.
A couple lines from the book just to show you, the media, and you referenced this before, the media have become more tribal, their outlets often serving as a badge of personal identity. Conservatives and liberals, Trump fans and Trump bashers have split into ideological camps, unwilling to tolerate the slightest deviation from their side, wedded to their version of the truth.
Well, I go through this every day, and this is not just about my book. I will do a show in which I will have guests of different opinions, pro and anti-Trump, and I will try to present the facts. And then I will go on Twitter and I will read simultaneously from the same segment, you have been a Trump hater since day one, why should we trust you? And the others will say, you are so far in the tank for Donald Trump that it's pathetic. What I say is, I'm not pro-Trump, I'm not anti-Trump, I'm pro-reality, I'm pro-good journalism. And that was the point that I was trying to hammer home here, which is some people are so wedded to their ideology that they're not really that interested in fairness. They want presentation in the media that supports their own views.
What's the worst criticism you ever got from the president?
This is fascinating because I bumped into him in the White House a few months ago, and he somehow, manages, either people tell him or he somehow sees what I do, and he said, your problem, Howie, is that you're too down the middle. And I said, well, Mr. President, in my world, that's a compliment. But he's always working the refs. He once told me I was too neutral, which is, of course, my job. So if that's the worst criticism, that's okay. It has been interesting to watch his evolution. And the earlier point about people's ideological opinions, I believe the coverage of the president, and I laid this out in great detail, is it goes beyond ideology. Because, look, every conservative Republican president, you go back to Reagan, you go back to George W. Bush, didn't have a lot of sympathetic press when it came to policies. With this president, there's something more personal, more visceral. The way he talks, he can sound like the guy in the bar. A lot of people like that. He doesn't sound like a politician who chooses every syllable carefully. Should a president choose his words more carefully than he does at times? Sure. But that's why ideology is not the only prism through which to view the coverage. You have to look at what it is about Donald Trump that so gets under the skin of so many journalists.
This is Patricia from Minneapolis, Republican line.
Oh, good morning. Nice to talk to you, Mr. Kurtz.
Hi, Patricia.
Hi. The lady from New York touched on what I'd like to say, one of my points. Please don't cut me off, Pedro. I have more than one. She mentioned how the media, one side wouldn't be talking about anything. The mainstream media has become so unhinged and so personal and so hateful. A constant negative coverage of President Trump. But what the other thing is they don't talk about his accomplishments, the good economy, all of the things that he's actually done, cutting regulations. They avoid all of that and just talk so awfully about him as a person, all ad hominem attacks. The other thing is C-SPAN itself. They read from all of the liberal papers, Washington Post, New York Times, article after article.
Including the Washington Times, including the Washington Examiner, including other conservative sources. So we'll just leave it there. Mr. Kurtz, take what you want.
Okay. There have been times, as I show in this book, where the president has gotten rare amounts of positive coverage. For example, the bombing in Syria after the chemical attacks by Assad. Even some of his most liberal critics applauded that and said it was something that Barack Obama hadn't done. But by and large, for the whole first year, the president was measured by the press for how much he got through Congress, which wasn't much, particularly with the failed effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. When he finally passed the tax cuts, there were a number of stories that said, he didn't have that bad a year, despite what you heard the last 11 months. He got the major tax cut bill through. He has slashed regulations. The economy is doing well. So there was some sort of grudging acknowledgement that the president was being more effective than perhaps most journalists were allowing. But what often happens in these moments, he gives a good speech to Congress. He did it last year, and the State of the Union was a pretty good speech, is that in our speeded up news cycle, it lasts a day and a half. And then suddenly, there's a new Russia investigation. Let's go chase this. Let's go chase that. What about this hurricane? How did he handle that? And so whatever positive coverage this president gets tends to be overtaken by other events, and sometimes tends to be overtaken by his own tweets. And he knows that these tweets drive news coverage, and you can see that every day. So there are some times when he kind of steps on his own good news, perhaps inadvertently.
What do you think about the coverage of his relationship with past porn stars, allegedly, or Playboy models, or women who've claimed that he assaulted? What do you think about that as far as the coverage of Donald Trump?
I have the impression that neither of these latest two cases have been as big stories as they might have been, because I think it involves his private life. A decade ago, I think it sort of baked into the cake. People knew they weren't electing a choir boy as president. No, it reminds me a little bit of Bill Clinton after Jennifer Flowers, other things in the '92 campaign. The difference, I would say, is that you have in two cases now allegations of hush money being paid, in one case by the president's personal lawyer to the former porn star Stormy Daniels. He says it's not hush money, but he hasn't fully explained what that $130,000 was. In the other case, you have allegations about the National Enquirer buying the story of the former Playmate and then not publishing it. There's some dispute about the facts there. That seems to me to be more recent and more troublesome, and I'm not sure that story has gone away. Are these tabloid stories? Whenever I talk about them, you're just going tabloid. Well, yeah, but it's the same thing I did in 1998 when Bill Clinton was embroiled with allegations, which turned out to be true, about Monica Lewinsky as well as other women in his life. Sometimes we live in a tabloid world, and we can't escape covering that.
From New York, Independent Line, Mike, go ahead.
Howard.
Sir.
Yes, love your show, and basically when I can't see it, I basically record it. I do want to touch on a couple of points that you made as far as Trump is concerned with the outlets that he has to the press. Basically, he will talk to anybody and everybody, and that's the one thing I like about him. And maybe cliche, he's a regular guy. He's not a politician. You know, Barack Obama, Clinton, Bush, they all just basically pulled off, wouldn't say anything to begin with. I can't wait to see to read your book, but my question to you is, do you think he'll ever be liked? And what I'm talking about as far as the running against Biden, and he's going to come up and probably go against him. How do you feel about how people are going to perceive him in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, I thought once he became president, because, you know, whatever people might say negatively about Donald Trump, you know, like anybody in public life, he can be a very charming guy. He can turn it on. He even was making nice with Chuck and Nancy, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, until more recent troubles in negotiating compromises on immigration. But it hasn't happened, and I think part of it is and the reason I'm not particularly optimistic, at least about a good, warm, or at least respectful relationship between the president and the press, is that both sides have strong incentives to keep this warfare up. Well, the president's going to go to the gridiron dinner. Maybe that's a bit of an olive branch. As I said, the news organizations, many of them, not all reporters at every organization, we sometimes paint with too broad a brush, are playing or are getting a big audience for commentary, for reporting, for investigations that seem to be largely anti-Trump. And the president uses the press as a foil. When he doesn't like a story, he attacks the press. When he wants to change the subject, he attacks the press. It works for him more than any other president that I have seen. Now, right now, it's all about Donald Trump. We get into 2019 and 2020, and there are Democratic candidates running and ultimately a nominee. Then it's going to be, how do you feel about this president and what he's done, wrong and right, over the last 3 or 4 years, versus a living, breathing human being who also has a record. And that's going to change the coverage somewhat, as it always does.
Cindy is in Windsor, Connecticut. Democrats line.
Good morning. So I guess one point that I wanted to make. And, I mean, isn't it true that legislative changes take really 2 to 4 years to really have an effect on the economy and what we see? So, you know, I find that we keep making these comments of, you know, of Trump being in office for, you know, less than 2 years and the economy is doing well. I mean, isn't that from what was done in the previous administration?
Well, there's no question that Donald Trump inherited a relatively good economy from Barack Obama when he took office in 2017. Unemployment was already pretty low. At the same time, that has continued. And despite the recent reverses in the stock market, I mean, the Dow is way up compared to what it was when he took office. Now, I always say that presidents get too much credit when the stock market goes up and too much blame when it goes down. Few people in the press talked about Trump's role when the Dow was soaring. As soon as it went down, you heard a lot more. Well, maybe this is Trump's fault. Some legislative changes take a couple of years to have an impact, but not tax cuts. I mean, beginning this month, I believe, the tax cuts are taking effect and people are seeing it in their paychecks. The tax cut was not popular when it was passed. Unusual. People usually like to get tax cuts. But the polls are showing it's getting a little more popular now that it seems real. Because a lot of people didn't think they were going to get it. They looked at the ideological battle and said, well, that's for someone else. It's not for me. So I think, sure, is it early to issue a definitive judgment on President Trump's impact on the economy after a year and a couple months in office? Yeah, I would say it is. But at the same time, he hasn't done anything to impede the growth that most people have felt, particularly if you own stocks and bonds.
We're running short on time. Joe from Garland, Texas, Republican line. Go right ahead.
Yes, I would just like to make the statement. I'm 84 years old. There was a time in my life when Walter Cronkite reported the news that while you might not agree with him, you knew it was the truth. And then along came Dan Rather. And then this is where we are today. Thank you.
Dan Rather, interestingly enough, is still active and has become very anti-Trump. So he's obviously more in an opinion mode now. Look, There was a time when, Huntley, Brinkley, Walter Cronkite, these had a lot of respect. Most Americans got their news from the three network newscasts. That time is long gone. Social media, the internet, cable news, it's a much more fractured and polarized media universe, and that has created a lot of niches for a lot more opinion, analysis, punditry. The days of Cronkite, and I knew Walter Cronkite and I had great respect for him, but they're not coming back.
As far as your own show and your own profession, how do you personally keep editorial controls on what you report and put on the air?
I have complete independence to put on the air what I want, to say what I want, to analyze the way I want. That means if I make a mistake, it's on me. We all make mistakes, and I try to keep that in mind. People sometimes think, and I got this when I've worked for other news organizations, well, you're just following this line or that line. Because I'm a media critic, it means I'm not real popular in the business, because too often I have to call out colleagues who have made a mistake. Sometimes journalists can tend to be rather thin-skinned, let's put it that way. But when I decided to do this, I decided that the only way I could do it was to not only be aggressive about journalism and cover it like any other beat, but also to take on my employer when necessary. That was true at the Washington Post, true at CNN, true now at Fox. If Fox makes a mistake, does something wrong, overplays or underplays a story, I talk about it and I ask people their opinions of it. I think that in the end that adds to your credibility. People see that you're willing to hold everyone to the same standard.
As far as your personal show, Media Buzz host, what's the format and when is it on?
It is on every Sunday, 11 Eastern. Somebody said it should be on daily, but that's not happening right now. We take a look, we don't just talk about politics and Trump. We take a look at sports controversies, cultural controversies, Hollywood, sexual harassment cases, which are very much in the news. And we do it with a balanced panel. We try to get newsmakers on. And we have a lot of fun doing it. We take it seriously, but we have a lot of fun doing it.
How long have you been doing this show?
I've been at Fox now 4 years. I'm doing this show there. I did my own version of the show at CNN for 16 years. I was at the Washington Post for nearly 30 years. So when I criticize the mainstream media, I'm a product of the media. I know its strengths and weaknesses.
Howard Kurtz is the author of Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, the War Over Truth. And thank you for being our guest.
Great to be here. Really enjoyed it.
We are going to continue on with open phones for the last half hour of the program. However, the House is in a pro forma session, which means they'll come in, they'll gavel in, do some rudimentary business, and then gavel out again. When they come out, we'll go to open phones. So let me give you the number so you can start calling. 202-748-8001 for Republicans. It's 202-748-8000 for Democrats. And it's 202-748-8002. Again, if you want to make your thoughts known on the phone lines, choose the line that best represents you. You can also put on our social media site at C-SPAN WJ, and you can also go to our website at cspan.org, our Facebook page at facebook.com/cspan. Let's try to squeeze in one more call to see if we can get it in before open halts, Mr. Kurtz, if you don't mind. Nampa, Idaho, independent line. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Dan.
Dan, go ahead, real
guys.
quick.
How you doing?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, quick. Oh, well, I actually had a question for Howard on why he thought maybe Trump would get reelected with all the scandal going on and everything else that involves Donald Trump. I'm a Vietnam veteran. The country's severely divided. D.C. is broke.
Okay, thanks, caller.
We need.
All right, just to be clear, I didn't say that I thought that Donald Trump would be reelected. Who knows? 2 years from now is a lifetime in politics. I did say that I didn't underestimate his ability to get elected. On my show on the Sunday before the election, everybody said Hillary, New York Times, 98%. I said Donald Trump could win. The media shouldn't rush to judgment here. But the next election is a long way off.
Howard Kurtz of the book Media Matters. Thanks again. Howard Kurtz is the Media Buzz host for the Fox News Channel and the author of the latest book, Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, and the War Over the Truth. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Could you connect the dots between those things, the president, the press, and this matter of truth? What are you trying to say?
I'm trying to say there's a scorched earth warfare going on between the two sides. Now, in every administration, you said you read my book, Spin Cycle, about the Clinton White House, there is a natural adversarial tension between the two. But we have never seen anything like this. We have never seen such unrelentingly negative coverage, often very personal, harshly personal, I would say, in nature, as we are seeing against this president. And we have never seen a president of the United States constantly on the attack against the news business, fake news, dishonest media, and I think it's damaging both sides. But my great concern in writing this as a lifelong journalist is that it's damaging the press more.
Well, how has the press changed, or at least coverage of the presidency changed because of the president so far?
Well, I mean, we saw this beginning in the campaign when, first of all, the press, the pundits as a whole, didn't take Donald Trump all that seriously. He was a sideshow. It was very entertaining, but of course he wasn't going to make it to Iowa. He would never win the nomination, and everybody knew that he was not going to beat Hillary Clinton. I know your previous guest was talking about her. Beyond that, there were all these gloom and doom prophecies about, this controversy will finish him off. Well, he'll never survive this one. We see that again now. There is a sense in the mainstream press that many say that we can't normalize Donald Trump's presidency. What does that tell you? First of all, it tells you they view him as unfit for office. Many, not all, many reporters are fair. And that they view him as, you've heard all the words, unhinged, mentally unbalanced, incompetent, but also a dictator. It's interesting, the range of descriptions of this president. At the same time, this is a book that goes behind the scenes at the Trump White House. I talk about how the president suffers in his AIDS description guy and so forth. A year ago, he had a private off-the-record meeting with network anchors in which they asked him his biggest surprise as president. He says, it's that you guys never changed your coverage once I became president. And this, of course, dovetails with all the major events of his presidency, the Charlottesville tragedy, the Russia investigation, which is back in the news. He is just convinced he's not getting a fair shake, but he also meets privately with people like NBC's Chuck Todd, I explained in the book, and others, because there's a way in which he works the refs. He's trying to win them over. He's done it with me.
But even right in the book, apart this, he say Donald Trump is staking his presidency as he did his election on nothing less than destroying the credibility of the news media, and the media are determined to do the same to him. You go on, but expand on that in light of what you just said.
Yeah, well, there is now, it turns out to be good box office for major news organizations. You turn them on at night. There are these panels 6-1 against Trump, who are sort of largely appealing to an anti-Trump audience. It may be good business, but the problem is there is a whole chunk of the country, 63 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump. Many still enthusiastically support this president. And to them, not only do they think that their guy, their champion, is being treated unfairly, but they believe, with some justification, as I write in Media Madness, that the elite media, particularly here in Washington, New York, LA, look down on them, view them condescendingly. There's one headline I'll never forget in the left-leaning Huffington Post. A vote for Trump was a hate crime. Well, that kind of condescending attitude does undercut the credibility of the media among those who are not within this particular bubble.
Howard Kurt's our guest. He is the Media Buzz host on the Fox News channel and also the author of the book Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, and the War Over the Truth. If you want to ask him questions about the coverage of Donald Trump, President Trump, by the media, you can call 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, Independents, 202-748-8002. And you
from defiance disorder, they tell him not to do something. He does it anyway because nobody tells Donald Trump what to do. And there are times when it is very effective for him to lash out at the press, which he thinks and which his supporters believe is treating him very unfairly. And there are times when he goes too far or distracts from his own agenda.
You tell a story in the book about meeting Donald Trump, and he said things to you about how he views press, particularly negative coverage. What did he say?
Well, I interviewed the now president a half dozen times during the campaign. In fact, I first met him in the late 1980s in New York, and that's one of the reasons I did underestimate him in the campaign. I saw his media mastery as a New York guy. What he said to me was that he couldn't get over the fact that some commentators, in his view, have hatred for him. He used that word, hatred, and he is a counterpuncher, and so if somebody hates him, he hates back on them. But at the same time, he was kind of wounded by that, and there is a love-hate relationship in a way, mostly hate right now, with this president, because he really wants the approval of the media. He always got good media coverage by and large when he was a businessman, reality TV show.